Welcome to this webinar organised by the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Many of you are very familiar with us, but I have also seen names on the registration list that are a bit new, so with apologies to those who know us well, just 30 seconds or even less about the IISD. We're a non-profit think tank. We're based in Canada, but we do a lot of work from our Geneva office on investment policy, on energy policy, on climate adaptation, and on trade policy. And this stream of work supporting WTO members in their negotiations of new rules, new additional rules on fisheries subsidies fits within our trade policy work. My name's Alice Tipping. I lead all of our trade policy work, and you'll be hearing a little bit from me as I moderate this afternoon's session. And you'll also hear from my colleague Tristan Irschlinger, who is our real fisheries subsidies expert, as he delivers some of the presentations. Maybe just a quick overview of what we're going to be trying to achieve today. We've set aside 3 hours for this webinar, which we recognize is a long time for a webinar. It's a long time for people to be sitting looking at your screens. So we're going to aim to make it as concise as possible. If we finish before 5 p.m. Geneva time, that's absolutely fine. Also because a lot of the presentations you're going to hear this afternoon, all of them will be made available on our website, along with a recording of this webinar, minus the questions and discussion, and all of that because we're going to be presenting a lot of numbers and a lot of data this afternoon, and that's intentional. This webinar is essentially designed as a complement to the information session that the WTO Secretariat organized last month for WTO members as they prepare for this second phase of negotiations on fisheries subsidies. And this second phase is, of course, designed to complete the agreement that was reached in June last year by adding additional disciplines specifically focused on those fisheries subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, to complement the rules that were agreed last year with additional rules. So this webinar is designed to give you, as government officials, the best scientific evidence and data that we can provide that you don't already have from the WTO session about the scope and scale of fishing in different parts of the world and of the subsidies that are provided to different scales of fishing effort. For those of you who have been involved in these negotiations for many years, some of this data will be familiar, although some of it is also slightly different because the scientific databases on which we have asked experts to extract data have been updated. So the data is and reflects the latest data that the scientists can provide for us. So we're going to run through 2 sessions this afternoon. The first focuses essentially on understanding some of the really key concepts that underlie all of your negotiations. What is overcapacity? What is overfishing? How are they related? And these, again, for those of you who have been doing these negotiations for a while, may be useful refreshers. For those of you who are new to these negotiations, we find these are important concepts to understand as a basis. So my colleague Tristan Irschlinger will give you a reminder of the basic concepts that underpin the negotiation and give you kind of a word from our perspective on the scope of discussions that remain for you. We're then going to hear from Yannick Rousseau, who is an independent fisheries expert, and he's going to give us a sense of the context that we're working in if we're looking specifically at overcapacity and overfishing. He's going to answer a question that is at once very simple and very difficult, which is what do we know about the evolution of fishing capacity and fishing effort globally over the last few decades? What has brought us to where we're at today? That will be essentially the focus of our first hour of discussion. We have budgeted time generously this time to allow you lots of time for questions. If you would like to hold your questions until you've had time to absorb all of the information and come back to either us or the experts later, that is absolutely fine too. So after we've walked through the key concepts and the context, we're going to cover in a second session a series of presentations that focus on the data that's available about the coverage of the new rules that you may be negotiating. And here, you know, the challenge, I'll bring this in at this point, the challenge from our perspective is that we have wanted to give you, in the data that we have asked the scientists to extract, enough definition to make the data useful to the kinds of rules that you might eventually negotiate, but not so much definition that we risk prejudging what the outcome of the negotiations might be, or even their direction. So if you find yourself feeling that the data doesn't go into quite as much detail as you might want or expect, that is in fact on purpose. Because again, we want to give you the basic building blocks of data and information that we feel will be useful, independent of what proposal you want to put on the table for the shape of these future rules. Needless to say, the scientists who are presenting the data will also show you where the data comes from, where it is publicly available, so that you can, perhaps also with their help, go into the data and use it yourselves and understand it better. So we're going to give the floor again to Yannick at the beginning of that session, because it will be 11 p.m. where he is. So we're going to give him the floor first. And he's going to talk to us about the data that he has available about fishing effort by region, by development status, and by the kinds of maritime area. We're then going to give the floor to Deng Palomares, who is a senior scientist and project manager at the Sea Around Us project at the University of British Columbia. And we've asked her to extract for you data on catch from the Sea Around Us website, which is, or a database, which has recently been updated. And again, it'll be fisheries catch by region, by development status of the entity fishing, by types of maritime areas, and by the scale of fishing. We'll then turn to Anna Schubauer, who is familiar to many of you, another independent fisheries scientist, to give us her disaggregation of the very global data that we have from Rashid Sumaila's work, again, disaggregating that on subsidies by region, by development status, and by scale of fishing. And our last presenter in the second session is Ernesto Fernandez Monge, who again is familiar to many of you. He's a senior officer at the Pew Charitable Trusts, and he's going to be presenting the tools, publicly accessible tools that the Pew Charitable Trusts have developed for you to use to help understand who subsidizes what and where, as far as this is knowable or able to be estimated, and also a specific atlas that they've developed on distant water fishing. So again, what we're aiming to do is to give you data, an overview of the data that's available to you as you enter into these negotiations. And if you have more questions or want to use it yourselves, a sense of who you can go to ask these questions. After that, we'll open for some open discussion. We're interested in your sense of how far the data helps you in your negotiations going forward. And we're particularly interested to hear from you about what additional data on what topics you would find useful as you prepare for work this year and in the lead up to MC13. So if you find yourself jotting down questions as we go along, what about this? Please let us know at the very end of the webinar. You can also do it bilaterally if you wish, because again, it's our role, as it always has been, to give you the best input we can to help you craft the best rules that you can for the sustainable development of all of your fisheries. So with that overly long piece of introduction, I'm going to hand the floor quickly now to my colleague Tristan to walk us through some of the basic concepts, just so we have those very clear in our heads. Go ahead, Tristan.
Thanks a lot, Alice. Let me know if you have trouble hearing me. Otherwise, I will assume everyone hears me.
Just fine. Go ahead.
Great. So hi, everyone. As Alice explained, the idea of this very short introductory presentation is to provide a bit of a refresher on some of these basic concepts that underlie negotiations, in particular key concepts of maritime law and fisheries management. An important caveat is that this will be a high-level overview, so it won't reflect all the complexities that may exist in how different actors interpret some of these concepts. A number of you will also be familiar with several of these concepts, but for those who are not, we thought it would be useful to have a reminder of these concepts. And finally, towards the end, we'll say a few words about the coverage of existing rules, those that were agreed at MC12, and what remains to be disciplined, which will be the focus of these continued negotiations. So starting at the most basic level, the first set of concepts relates to maritime areas. So these are parts of the ocean that are delimited under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and to which different rules apply. Not all WTO members are parties to UNCLOS, but despite this, these concepts are commonly understood and respected in practice. So the first area, the area that's closest to the coast, is called the territorial sea, and it's a band that extends at most 12 nautical miles out to sea from the baseline, which is often the coast. And governments have sovereign rights over these waters, which means that that the coastal state has full jurisdiction on the activities in the territorial sea, with the exception that it must allow the innocent passage of foreign vessels through the territorial sea. Then there is a further band of sea which is adjacent to the territorial sea and which extends at most 24 nautical miles from the baseline. It's called the contiguous zone. And in this zone, the coastal state can only exert limited control for the purposes of preventing or punishing infringements of its customs, fiscal, immigration, and sanitary laws and regulations. So this zone is really much about strengthening the coastal state's capacity to enforce its own national laws. Probably most importantly, there is then another larger zone, which is also adjacent to the territorial sea, and which is called the exclusive economic zone, or the EEZ. And it's a much broader, much wider band of water that extends to 200 nautical miles from the baseline of a coastal state. And under UNCLOS, coastal states have the exclusive right to exploit marine resources within their EEZ, but they also have obligations to manage those resources sustainably. The concept of territorial sea, of exclusive economic zone, and most recently of contiguous zone have come up in WTO negotiations, but not always by using those exact terms. So, for example, in the draft agreement that was on the table at MC12, and also in the final agreement, actually, the territorial sea and the contiguous zone were referred to just by describing the distance from the baseline, so 12 nautical miles or 24 nautical miles. Under the overcapacity and overfishing pillar of the negotiations, these zones have been used in particular in the context of proposed exemptions, which would allow developing country members to keep providing subsidies that would otherwise be prohibited. Finally, on this slide, the last area to be aware of is what is called the high seas, or areas beyond national jurisdiction. And that's basically everything that goes beyond coastal states' EEZs. So states can fish freely on the high seas, but they have an obligation under UNCLOS to do so sustainably, and they are obliged to cooperate where necessary. And this cooperation is usually done through the establishment or through joining regional fisheries management organizations, which we will address in a further slide. But before that, I just wanted to provide you with this simple visual recap of these different maritime zones. So again, territorial sea, the coastal state has full sovereignty. Then contiguous zone, the coastal state has limited control for law enforcement purposes. In the EEZ, it has sovereignty over the use of marine resources, but also the obligation to use resources sustainably. And finally, on the high seas, all states have the freedom to fish, but they must cooperate to ensure the resources are not overexploited. As we've briefly mentioned, to regulate fishing on the high seas, Many states have become members of regional fisheries management organizations or arrangements. And there are broadly two kinds of RFMOs. The first kind is RFMOs that govern only certain species in a particular area, for example, tuna and tuna-like species. And these species-specific RFMOs are illustrated here on this slide at the top. So the first one, the first map that you see at the top of the slide. The second kind of RFMO is the RFMOs that cover all species in a given area. So they have a more general management mandate. And these more generic RFMOs are illustrated on the other map, the map that you see at the bottom of the slide. Here, it's also useful to note that that RFMOs differ quite significantly in terms of what they can do and the types of measures they can establish. So some of them will establish detailed limits on catch of certain species, but others only have much softer rules and measures in place. And things can also differ between species in a given RFMO, right? So you may have stricter measures on some species and softer measures on others, even in the same RFMO. Finally, a last remark on this slide, which is based on the two maps that you see here, is that most of high seas fishing is covered by RFMOs. So at the top, we see that species-specific RFMOs cover almost every bit of the high seas, which means that the most commercially valuable stocks are covered by an RFMO almost everywhere. And at the bottom, we see that that more generic RFMOs, which are responsible for marine resources in general in their geographic area, also cover most of the high seas. So this suggests that only a minority of high seas fishing does not fall within the competence of an RFMO. So let's now move to what are probably the most central concepts underlying ongoing negotiations. So these concepts are overcapacity and overfishing. And as you may recall, these two concepts were already present in the original WTO mandate for the negotiations. And here I mean the slightly more elaborated version of the mandate that was agreed in 2005 at the Hong Kong Ministerial. So if we start with overcapacity, we first need to define fishing capacity. And it can be defined as the amount of fish or fishing effort that a fleet can produce in a given period if the fleet is fully utilized. There are various indicators that can be used to measure capacity, but they often focus on the physical capital that's present in a fishery. For example, the number of boats or the total engine power of a fleet. Then if we move to overcapacity, it's defined as a situation where fishing capacity exceeds the level of capacity that's required to achieve the desired management objective. This management objective is often a given amount of catch, and it's often a given amount of catch that's called MSY, for maximum sustainable yield. But it can also focus more on socioeconomic aspects. So it can be something different, including maximizing profit or maximizing employment, for example. But in summary, overcapacity means that a fleet is too big, it's overcapitalized, and it has the ability to catch too many fish. If we take an example here, you could imagine a fishery in which the objective is maximum sustainable yield, and this is 2 tons of fish per day. And you have vessels that can catch 1 ton per day. And in this situation, 2 vessels are enough for achieving that level of catch. And that means that if you have 4 vessels in that fishery, there is overcapacity. And so it means either vessels will be underutilized, which means less profit per vessel, or they will end up catching too many fish overall as compared to what is sustainable. which is overfishing. And that brings us to the concept of overfishing. Overfishing can be defined as a situation where, for a given stock, the amount of fish that's caught is excessive in relation to the stock's size, the stock's biomass, and its reproduction rate. And this means that the desired management objective cannot be achieved or maintained sustainably. And here again, the management objective is often a level of catch, and it's often MSY, but it can be something else. But in summary, overfishing means that too many fish are actually being caught in a fishery. So in simple terms, capacity is a potential, which means that a fleet is too big and it can fish too much. It has the ability to fish too much. And overfishing is the materialization of that potential or of that risk, right? Which means that the fleet actually fishes too much. And if overfishing continues for a while, the number of fish, so the biomass of the stock, will gradually decrease until the stock is eventually considered to be in an overfished condition. Which brings us to this third but closely related concept, which is an overfished stock, or a stock in an overfished condition. So an overfished stock can be defined as a stock that has been fished beyond a set limit below which its biomass is considered to be too low. And this threshold below which a stock is overfished will again depend on where fisheries management authorities place the limit, but it's often set in relation to the level of biomass, so the stock size that can produce maximum sustainable yield. In simple terms, an overfished stock, or rather a stock that's in an overfished condition, essentially means that there are too few fish left in the water. And so we see that in practice, one problem often leads to another. So when a fleet is too big and there is overcapacity, then this fleet can fish too much and there is a risk of overfishing. In the absence of strict management, this risk will likely materialize. And even if there is management, the fleet can also exert pressure on authorities to increase catch limits to unsustainable levels. And if that occurs, there will also be overfishing. So then if overfishing occurs for long enough, this will deplete the stock until the resource, the stock itself, is badly reduced. And then you have a stock that's in an overfished condition. So we see how a stock being assessed as overfished is really the end of the causal chain, but the problem actually starts before. It's a problem that starts building before the stock is in an overfished condition. We referred in the two slides before to this concept of maximum sustainable yield. It's referenced in UNCLOS as part of the responsibilities of coastal states, and it's a concept that's often used as an objective by fisheries management authorities. Essentially, MSY is the maximum amount of catch that can be taken from a fish stock on a sustainable basis, so year after year. And it's the point at which the stock is the most productive. So it's a common target for fisheries managers for that reason. On the basis of this concept, fisheries managers would typically define target reference points with respect to two indicators. They often use FMSY, which is the level of fishing mortality at which a stock can produce MSY in the long term. And that is often used to determine if overfishing is occurring, right? If the rate of fishing is sustainable or too high in a fishery. And another reference point that is often used is called BMSY, and that's the level of biomass, so the stock size that allows to produce MSY. And that's used to determine if a stock is in an overfished condition or not. Now, just a note of caution to say that there are multiple variations of these MSY-based reference points, but the idea is essentially the same, right? It's to keep fishing mortality and the stock's biomass at levels that allow to maximize catch in the long term, so in a sustainable way. But it's also important to note here that it's not the only type of targets that are used. And in negotiations on fisheries subsidies at the WTO, some members have flagged that in some circumstances, these MSY-based reference points can be difficult to use, in particular because they require quite a bit of data that may not be available. So that's why footnote 11 of the agreement that was reached last June at MC12 allows members to use other reference points in determining what the sustainable level is for a stock. And that's also relevant to future negotiations on overcapacity and overfishing, because the same approach was envisaged for the management exemption under the suggested prohibition of subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity. So the one that was in the draft agreement at the Ministerial. To conclude that introductory presentation, I thought it would be useful to also say a few words about where we are in terms of rules. And one useful approach to look at where we stand is to underline that the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement has established important rules to address the negative impacts of subsidies in the most alarming situations, or what can be called the red light situations. So when it's clear that you have IUU fishing, when it's clear that stocks are overfished, or when there is absolutely no management regime in place. So when fishing occurs on the high seas, but outside the competence of any RFMO. But from that perspective, what we are then left with is what we can call orange light situations. So meaning subsidies to fishing in EEZs and under RFMOs, which, by the way, is the overwhelming majority of global fishing. But when there is no assessment that a stock is overfished, or no determination that IUU fishing has occurred. So in these situations, subsidies can still have very negative impacts by encouraging overcapacity and overfishing, but they're currently not captured under current rules. What I've tried to do with this very last slide is to illustrate this visually. So what you see here is an abstract map, which shows the only type, which shows that the only type of situations in which all subsidies are prohibited is when fishing occurs on the high seas and does not fall within the competence of an RFMO. And that's the area that you see in red here on the map. But in all the other situations, so fishing in an EEZ or under RFMOs, which you can see in orange here, subsidies are only prohibited in cases of IUU fishing or when stocks are assessed as overfished. And when that's not the case, then subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing are not disciplined. So they only, it means the rules only address the most alarming situations in these areas or in these circumstances. So from that perspective, one way to see the ongoing negotiations is that they provide an opportunity to address more directly what's really the root cause of the problem. And here I mean overcapacity and overfishing, and not only the most acute manifestations of that problem. And that's because the problem really starts when there is excessive investment in a fishery, or when incentives are provided to fleets to fish beyond sustainable levels. So that's about it for this introductory presentation. I hope that was useful. We'll share the slides, all the slides actually, so that you can have a look afterwards if you would like to go back to some of them. So many thanks for your attention, and with this, back to you, Alice.
Super. Thank you very much indeed, Tristan. I find that map very, very helpful, and I keep coming back to it. And another thing perhaps to mention is that, as Tristan said, in our conception, at least, the focus of the negotiations and the on subsidies contributing to overcapacity and overfishing really now needs to consider when that fishing happens in domestic EEZs, when it happens in foreign EEZs, and when it happens within the competence and under the competence of RFMOs. So you'll see as we go through the scientific data that in fact what we've done is ask the scientists, as far as they're able to pull data that refers to those three main areas and those three kinds of fishing, because for us this is the ground that is left to cover with the remaining rules. Okay, so now we have the concepts somewhat embedded. Yannick, I might turn to you next, because what your data shows us is a really interesting historical perspective of where we got to where we are today. So go ahead, please.
Thank you. I am going to talk to you a bit more in detail about the fishing fleet, fishing capacity, fishing effort, if I manage to share my screen properly. Technology, always the right things. Can you see the right part of the screen?
Yeah, that's perfect. Go ahead.
Perfect. So I'm going to talk to you about the global fishing fleet, so fishing capacity, fishing effort. I am going to have a bit of a review of some of the concepts that Tristan just explained, noting that it's important to always remember that scientists have a usually slightly different way of defining this concept compared to policymakers, because we do them with the idea of doing calculations on them. So we really focusing on the number aspect of things. So there will be some overlap. The rough concepts are the same, but there might be some slight differences. Getting into these definitions. So the word capacity and effort are sometimes used interchangeably, but they are really different concepts. As Tristan was saying, capacity is more the physical assets and more economy related. That's going to be the number of vessels, the size, the engine, everything that can be invested in and easily calculated. The effort is a concept that adds something slightly less tangible and reports more on the actual fishing activity. As Tristan was saying, that's how we're going to use this capacity. So that's going to be things such as the time spent at sea, how many vessels are idle, which is actually, in a sense, the root of overcapacity. Everything that's going to be in repair, how much capacity utilization there is. And so it's not just the physical vessels, but also how much fishing they actually are doing. One vessel having 10-hour fishing is not the same than two vessels having 5 hours of fishing, even though at the end of the day, the effort seems to be the same. Then there is another slightly more tricky aspect, which is the difference between nominal and effective effort. In the vast majority of cases, people, when they talk about effort, they're thinking about nominal fishing effort. Explaining that, so the nominal effort, it's what people think about, which it is when you add all these elements, the time, the number of people to the capacity, the number of vessels, the engine power, and so on and so forth. It's really the direct utilization of the fleet. The effective effort adds another layer of complexity, which is all of this plus the evolution of non-tangible components. Usually we refer to those as being technology and knowledge. And by technology, I mean the type of technology that cannot be easily measured. So not the size of the vessels or the engine power, but things which are a bit more complicated, like the presence of AIS, telecommunication system, or all these kind of things. If there's going to be a radar put in the boat, all these things that would actually increase the efficiency of the boat, but which are very difficult to measure. And there is the knowledge element. A fisher who is going to give his knowledge, to pass his knowledge on to the next generation, or even his own knowledge from one year to another of where the fishing grounds are, means that from one year to another, his efficiency in fishing will actually increase because he has all this accumulated knowledge of how to fish, basically. This effective effort, so the capacity plus the nominal effort, so the hours and so on, plus the evolution of knowledge and technology is the effective effort, and it is what actually affects the ecosystems. Now, there's been quite a bit of change over the last 50 years, well, actually no, 70 years, sorry. War II was a long time ago. There's been quite a bit of change in effort in terms of the capacity and the effort. So first, I'm going to talk about the capacity. And as you can see, it has increased considerably in the last 70 years. It's still going on, and we do expect to have another 10% of vessels increasing in the last 10 years. So that's about 300,000 vessels which are going to be added to the current fishing fleet. And comparatively, we are going to have about 60 gigawatts of engine power, which is going to be added. It's a much quicker increase in engine power compared to the number of vessels. And this is due to the fact that at the same time that the number of vessels is actually increasing, there's a transition between unmotorized vessels and motorized vessels, which is continuing, which has been accelerating actually. And of these 300,000 vessels, which actually are going to appear, you might have maybe 400,000 vessels motorized, which are going to appear, and 100,000 vessels unmotorized, which are going to disappear, which leads to this 300,000 vessels increase. But obviously, a motorized vessel has much more power, literally, than a non-motorized one, and therefore will be capable of having a much greater fishing effort. So this is actually exactly what I was talking about. This is an aspect, focusing on the artisanal fleets, which is these small vessels that a lot of fishers have. Actually, the vast majority of the fleet, about 3/4 of the fleet, if not more, is considered artisanal in the world. And this artisanal fleet is the reason why there is such a strong increase in the engine power compared to the number of vessels that are going to increase. So all of this has a direct effect on the fishing effort, as the engine power that dictates how fast a boat can go, but also how far, how much cargo can be dragged, and also, most importantly, the type of gears that they can use. Dragging a net requires way more engine power than a fishing line. So as these vessels are slowly replaced by vessels which actually have an engine and or who have more engine power than before, it's more likely that they're going to start having more nets, especially seines, Danish seines, trawl, all this kind of gears which have a strong effect on the ecosystem. The increase in engine power is directly transferred to an increase in fishing efforts. As I was saying in the early concept, the fishing effort is usually considered to be the capacity and then multiplied by something such as the time that it takes to fish. So if you have an increase in this capacity, if you have an increase in engine power, you get a direct increase in fishing effort, unless you decide to fish less hours, which realistically doesn't happen. Here, it doesn't seem too much, but it's actually a logarithmic axis because of something that I'm going to go to, which is the difference between nominal and effective effort. This is the nominal effort, and we expect to have a bit of an increase soon, about 35% of nominal fishing effort increasing in the last 10 years or in the next 10 years or so. But if you add the things which are a bit more complicated to measure, like radar, GPS, general technology, knowledge, and all this kind of stuff, you have the effective fishing effort. And this one is a tiny bit more. Remember, that's the one that actually is going to be affecting the ecosystem. And this one is not expected to increase by 35% in the next 10 years, but to increase by 150%, which means that in these 10 years or so, 35% of the effect on ecosystem from the fleet comes from the increase in engine power, increase in number of vessels, and so on and so forth. But that another 115% increase comes from things which are a bit more difficult to quantify and a bit more difficult to stop. You are not going to prevent people from getting GPS. You're not going to prevent people from talking to one another. And as they say, you can't stop progress. So there will always be transfer of technology. Fishers will keep on learning from experience and other things like that. One thing about this is that the effective fishing effort, unlike the nominal fishing effort, is not something you can give an absolute value to. Since it refers to things which are not really tangible, you can only compare them to another. That's why here on these graphs, the nominal and effective fishing effort are the same for 1950, because 1950, in my calculations, were used as a base of how much technology has progressed. So you can't just say tomorrow that the effective fishing effort, which is the actual effect on the ecosystem, is that much. You cannot. You can simply say that, well, it will be 10% more next year than it was this year. What are the implications for ecosystem? Well, the direct implication is, well, the increase on the catch per unit of effort, or in this case, the decrease on the catch per unit of effort. So this measure, the CPUE, is at the same time the efficiency of the fleet and the abundance of the fish, because catch per unit of effort is literally the catch related to the abundance compared to the effort. So an increase in CPUE or decrease in CPUE will mean that either the efficiency of the fleet is increasing or an increase of the biomass, and vice versa. A decrease in CPUE means either a decrease in efficiency or a decrease in biomass. Now, the nominal CPUE, so the basic calculation, has decreased about 30% since the 70s. When you consider the effective effort, which is actually the thing that matters with ecosystem, that has decreased by about 85% since the 70s. We have not only increased the number of vessels and the raw engine power, the raw power substantially since the 70s, but we also increased considerably our technology and knowledge of the marine environment. And we also impacted the ecosystem heavily. Now, I said before that decrease in CPUE can mean a decrease in efficiency or a decrease in biomass. And it's kind of both. The most obvious here is the decrease in biomass. There are less fish in the sea than there's been 50 years ago. There's quite a lot of talk about that. Not everybody agrees on the exact number, but we consider that anything between 20 and 50, 70% of the stocks globally are overfished. But the efficiency part is the tricky one. Technology and knowledge and the number of fleet, all of these things have actually increased. But at the same time, since there are less fish in the sea, it's becoming more and more difficult to catch the fish. So even though we increase the raw power, we actually somehow decrease the efficiency because it's not linear. If there are half you would expect if there is half as many fish in the sea that it will take twice the amount of effort to catch the same thing. That's not the way it works. If you have half the amount of fish in the sea, you might actually need 4 times the amount of effort. And that continues, this difference between the two continue to increase. And if you consider that maybe we have only 25%, 30% of the stocks left in the sea, that increase the amount of effort you need to put in to catch the exact same amount by 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Now, this decrease in CPUE is not just a global phenomenon. In every region, we can see the same pattern. There's some variation, obviously. It's faster in some region or other. It might have started a bit earlier, a bit later. The increase in technology and knowledge is quite pernicious. Some regions have managed to stabilize the nominal effort. That's going to be the European Union, for instance, Northern America, and even in Northeast Asia. China is doing quite a lot in reducing the fishing effort and the capacity and the fishing effort. And that will reduce the nominal effort and therefore stabilize the nominal CPUE. But when you add all these things that you cannot stop, the technology, the progress, the knowledge, well, then in that case, the CPUE has decreased everywhere, and it actually is continuing to do so. And there is very little that can be done unless the nominal effort is decreased considerably. So now, what are the implication of that? So, as I said, we have the 3 aspects that we start with on the left. So that's the capacity, the capital, the fishing time, which is going to create the effort, and the technology and knowledge. If you combine the capacity and the fishing time, you get the nominal effort. And then if you add the knowledge and the extra technology you get on that, you get the effective effort. The effective effort will have an effect on the biomass to lead to the CPUE, which is the main indicator we use to try to figure out if a stock is healthy, or at least if we are fishing the stock sustainably or not. But as I said, there is an impact of the effort on the biomass. The more we fish, the more we kill, and therefore there is less and less biomass. So there is going to be this feedback effect between the effort that we're increasing and the biomass, which is then going to decrease. Problem with that, we cannot do anything about the biomass. As much as we want, we are not going to go at sea and make the fish breed faster. The biomass is there. Nature is doing its course. There are some environmental effects actually making it worse, climate change, all these kind of things, but we cannot actually make it better. We can only just make it not worse. Then there is the technology and the knowledge. I said before, and everybody always hear that, you can't stop progress. You will not prevent people from having better phone, which are going to have access to GPS, which tell them in real time where the stock is actually going. So all of this will actually increase the raw power of the fleet. So these 2 aspects, you cannot do anything. So if you want to actually get a better CPU, if you want to stabilize that, you have to stabilize the effective effort and therefore the nominal effort, and therefore the only 2 things you can do is to either work on the capacity or the fishing time. Now, problem is that if we continue of increasing the capacity, or if we continue to stabilize the capacity, as the biomass decreases, as the CPUE decrease, well, then we will have to take this extra somewhere else, which will be the fishing time. And what does that mean? Is that not only would have an effect on the biomass, would have an effect on the environment, but it will also means that the fishers will have to fish less in terms of time. So that's a loss of income for them. that's going to be a loss of job, there's going to be a loss of livelihood. So as we continue with this capacity, it's not just the environmental, the biomass factor, which is affected, but also the human one. And we can see that in many places, that a lot of fishers are starting to convert from fishing full-time to fishing only part-time and having other jobs. They are going to work more in the industry, in the marketing aspect. But even this aspect, the marketing, the industry or the processing plants and so on and so forth will be affected if there is less fish to be sold. Well, there's going to be less market. So as we continue to keep a strong capacity and decrease the CPUE, we are actually hurting ourselves, because we're going to not only destroy the main source of all of this, which is the fish itself, but also we're going to destroy the economy that's based around that. So all of these concepts are linked to the increase in capacity. Now I'm going to stop here, because I hope I did not well, speak too much, but just a last thing, all this data is available. The link is here. It's quite a mouthful, but if you Google my name, Rousseau, with effort and IMAS, which is my my previous university, and data, you can find this. It's one of the first two links. So they both link to one another. At the moment, the data is rather raw and very, very heavy, but we are working on making it a bit more accessible, working on visualization and all this kind of stuff. So all of this data is available, it's transparent, all the methods are there. We're working on making sure that everybody can use them without heavy coding. And that's it. Give it back to you, Alice.
Super, Yannick. Thank you very, very much indeed. And thank you for giving us also the source to the data. I'm not sure I'm not sure how many people on the call will feel brave enough to dive into it, but what we might do with your permission is also give them your contact details in case they're interested in understanding how they can use the data and how they can read it. Rest assured, everyone, we have also asked Yannick to extract from that scary link some of the key pieces of data from his database, and he's going to be showing them to you in just a second. I did want to make sure that we had a little bit of time to for people to ask either Tristan or Yannick some questions. I saw there was one question in the Q&A which Tristan has answered about MSY, so that's fine too. If you'd rather not put your hand up, you can put your questions in the Q&A and the speakers can answer it online. So I'm going to pause here and wait for hands or other questions in the Q&A. But while you think about what you might want to ask, Yannick, I did want to thank you very much, because you answered a question that was coming up in my head as you went along, which was also what are our levers? As you say, you can't stop progress. We're not going to stop fishers from adopting better technology. A lot of that is safety related, and we want fishermen desperately to get home safely. And as you say, you know, we want the industry to learn, and we want people to be able to fish more sustainably. So thank you at the end for bringing us back to the question of capacity and fishing time. But thank you also for then taking us to the real social and political consequences of adopting and thinking about policy that affects those two variables. Because as you've said, it seems to be, you know, the sort of the invidious option that many governments face is either letting the problem persist and become worse and more urgent, or tackling it now and helping their fisheries sectors to transition to more sustainable profitability. And in my head, I mean, that's sort of what these negotiations are really meant to be all about. We all want our fisheries to be profitable. We want them to be profitable forever, right? And to do that, they have to be sustainable. Otherwise, as you say, the CPUE keeps decreasing, and we keep asking our fishers to go further for longer to catch less, which is frustrating for everyone, and additionally a safety risk, I would imagine. So thank you for bringing us back to that real political reality, which I think is really important, because the people on the call are government officials, and this is, you know, this is a real, it is a real fundamental challenge for all of us, I think, as we try and think about how these new sets of rules can be designed. I can't see any additional questions. Yeah, no, that was really helpful, I think, and I think it kind of, as we would say in English, it behooves us all. It is a responsibility on all of us to keep that social political focus, because this is essentially the, this is the impact and this is the change that we'd like to see. Okay, I don't see any other questions. I don't see any hands up, which is fine. Feel free to put questions in the chat as they occur to you, and we will have a little bit of time also later on as we go. So we've been going for an hour. If you'd like to stand up and stretch and grab some water, please do. We're going to move now into the second session, right? So this is the one where we ask the various scientific experts to pull from their databases particular points of data about fishing effort from Yannick, fishing catch from Deng, subsidies from Anna, and then a broader set of data and policy tools from Ernesto, to pull from their tools data that we think will be helpful to you as you go forward. Maybe two things to say. Firstly, I will be presenting at the very end a summary slide that has lots and lots of these key numbers on it. I'm not going to read through the whole slide because we will all get lost, and by that point it will be late on a Friday. But we will of course be sharing this slide with you, and we think I'll highlight 2 or 3 key points from it. But just to reassure you all, you won't have to go trawling through all of the slides you're about to see to capture the key points, because I'll present them in a summary slide and you will have that summary slide at the end. There's nothing in the summary slide that we have added. It is all figures that are presented by the scientific experts you're about to hear. The second point is that I think, as policymakers and policy analysts, bear in mind as we go through that this data is the best data that we are aware of that the scientific community can provide for you. It is data, all of it, at a very global level, which means that as research goes, you can either choose 2 options. You can estimate what you think is happening in the very big picture, top down, or you can gather very micro level data about a specific situation. Data about a specific situation has the advantage of being very accurate, but very limited to that very specific situation. Data at a global level is always going to be an estimate. So as you look at these figures, those of you who've been doing this work for a while know this, but it's worth articulating. As you look at these figures, remember that the real value to take away from them, I think, is orders of magnitude, right? What is the best estimate that the scientific community can give us about where catch takes place, where fishing effort takes place, where subsidies are provided? So again, read the data and interpret the data with that important filter in the top of your minds. Okay, I know there's a quick question to Yannick, which he's answering in the Q&A box, which is perfect. In fact, Yannick, I might need to ask you to stop typing because, oh, you're finished, super. Because what we'd like to do is to give Yannick, in fact, the floor next to talk a little bit about the data that he has specifically about fishing effort. And you've seen already kind of the global perspectives and the difference. I think we've all captured it now between nominal effort and effective effort. So actually counting fishing hours and capacity and time versus the intangible amount of the intangible elements that go into actual fishing effort as it's really practiced on the sea. So Yannick, can I draw you back perhaps from the Q&A box? Yeah, done, super. There's another question for you there, but I might ask you to answer it once you've done your next presentation, because I'm conscious also it is now almost approaching midnight where Yannick is, so we want to make sure we don't keep you up too late.
Not a problem.
Good multitasking there, by the way.
doing that as well. I'm actually going to go a bit more into some of these details actually now in the second part. So I will go again, but after I finish, I will answer the different questions as well. And if people are free to email me either directly or through the ISSD to get specific questions answered. Well, specific answers. Let's see, share the screen again and hide the Q&A, make it slightly less up. There we go. So in this part, I'm going to go back to the fishing efforts. I'm going to go into more details into the different aspects of the fishing efforts. In particular related to the different propositions there has been with the exceptions and so on and so forth. And I am going to talk about well, I'm going to make a small point about artisanal efforts, since it is an interesting concept that people often want to know a bit more about. So this one is going to be a lot of raw data. If there is any problem, do tell me. The graphs are going to be relatively simple and there's going to be a lot of numbers, but the idea with this is actually to be able to refer to them, not to learn them by heart or anything like that. So remember, I just talked about the past and the expected increase in the fishing efforts. I'm just going to go a bit more detail. And in this part, I'm going to focus on the nominal effort. So the effort that does not take into account the knowledge change, the small technology detail, as it is simpler to just give like a snapshot of that. And it does not really required to compare it to something else. I can just give you the data for specific year, which is going to be what I'm doing that. Most of the data that I'm going to present is an average of the data 2010 to 2020. The evolution in these years has been relatively constant all over the place. So some specific country trends might not be perfectly reflected. For instance, if a country, and I'm thinking in particular about what's been happening in China or the European Union in the last few years, that there's been a strong goal to reduce the fishing fleet, that might not necessarily be reflected in the, since it is an average of the last 10 years. The mapped data, which is the one I'm using later to talk about the fishing in the EZ, is only for the year 2017. Data for like the mapped data is extremely heavy. It requires a lot of computing power to even work on 1 year. So doing an average would have been a bit too complicated. So I'm going to present a lot of raw data relative to the amount of effort by different classifications, region, sector, development status, and so on. And as I said, it's more of a reference. There's no need to worry about remembering all the numbers by heart. So let's start by looking at the effort by region. I hope that you can see the graph because it's a bit small, and I'm very sorry if there is any person colorblind in the audience. There is nothing that can be done, I'm afraid, when you're dealing with 10 different values. There's a lot of colors. Anyway, so looking at the effort by region, so there are two main trends that's been happening. The effort of Europe and North America, mostly the US and Canada. In the way I'm defining that, I'm putting Mexico with Latin America, because the way of fishing is actually more similar, the technology and things like that, with the Caribbean than it would be with Canada, for instance. There is no geopolitics behind that. It's really based on the type of technology that people are using, the type of fisheries, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so the effort of Europe and Northern America and a handful of other countries, such as Japan and in the last few years, China, have registered an increase in effort first in the second quarter of this, since the from 1950s to 1970s. So I'm losing my with the numbers, and then declined since. The rest of the world, however, has increased almost consistently since, mainly due to a motorization of the fleet that I was talking about previously. In the 1950s, the vast majority of the world had unmotorized vessels, and then through the 60s, 70s, and then after the different wars, which actually spread the technology, a lot of motorization happened, first in Northeast and Southeast Asia, and then it has started to happen also in Sub-Saharan Africa. Nowadays, the global fishing effort is concentrated in Asia, which is not that much of a surprise, particularly in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, which combined account for more than 50% of the global effort. But they also represent about 30% of the world's population, so it kind of balances another. Sub-Saharan Africa, remains quite small, but has actually overtaken Europe as a whole in terms of the whole fishing effort, and also has surpassed the Middle East. Middle East, I include also the Maghrebinat, so from Morocco all the way to the Black Sea. Oceania and the Pacific Islands remain the smallest regional efforts, and most of that effort is actually dominated by Australia. The Pacific Islands have a relatively small effort, and their effort is dominated by tuna fishing fleets, which in my data I report as being part of other countries. So they are going to be European fleets, Japanese, Korean, Japanese, and so on and so forth. Talking about the biggest fishers in terms of the amount of effort, I would like you to note that the combined effort of the top 15 countries fishing the most is actually 2/3 of the global fishing effort. It's not surprising that most of Southeast and Northeast Asian countries are among the biggest fishers. And along that, you've got India, the USA, Chile, and Australia. I do not include the European Union as being a country, but it can be considered one because of the way the agreements were with the European Union and the way they're sharing their EEZ. As an entity, it can be considered one of the biggest players, but each European country individually are not part of this top 15. Roughly, the European Union is about the same level than Japan, so it's about 4% of the global fishing effort. Now, it's important to note that for the majority, the size of the effort is reflected in the size of the country. So either they're going to be in the top effort and in the top in population, or in top effort and top of the EEZ. There are some exceptions, and that would like you to focus on the right column of that table, the size of the EEZ. The countries in orange or red have a comparatively small fishing grounds for the amount of fishing effort that they're putting in, meaning that some of the effort that they have will either be exported to other country EEZ, the high seas, or that the fishing pressure on the EEZ is extremely intense. That said, in these countries, you have Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia waters are amongst the most prolific and rich in terms of fish in the world. So it's not exactly a perfect combination, but it's important to see that a large fishing effort in a small EEZ generally means that the EEZ is going to be overfished. Now, going into the development status, I'm not sure what considered development to be misspelled, but so about 3/4 of the global fishing effort is actually done by developing countries, mainly driven by the Asian fleet that I was talking about. So there is very often this misconception, this falsehood when people think about global fisheries, that industrial fleets, especially of Europe, of the US and Canada, are actually the biggest part of the effort and then the one driving the world. It used to be true, but not anymore. The vast majority of the fishing effort nowadays comes from developing countries. Developed nations, there are about 20%, a bit under 20% of the fishing effort. And the least developed countries are a relatively minor portion of the effort, just under 5%. There are a couple, I mean, there are a few non-members of the WTO, which account for a relatively negligible amount of the effort. Unrelated to that development status, the effort can be mapped. That's the data that I was talking about before on the link that I gave you. And therefore, it can be used to determine where the vessels are fishing. In the EZ, in another country, EZ, in with reciprocal agreements, sorry, or if they are fishing in the high seas. Again, and it's not too surprising, about 3/4 of the effort is carried out in the country's EZ, with less than 5% in the high seas and about 20% fishing in other countries' EZ. And now it's quite normal. The high seas is not that rich in fish. Most of the fish happens on the continental shelf. That's where the fishing grounds are actually the most prolific, and the continental shelf highly variable by ocean and by region, but in general, it would be 10, 20, 30 kilometers from the coast. So about 20 nautical miles, if my conversions are correct. Slight difference by region as well. For instance, the South Pacific region, the continental shelf there is much, much bigger, which means that they have much more prolific area for fishing, which is also why they can sustain, I mean, they have been able to sustain a really high fishing effort concentrated in smaller EZ for a while, because the continental shelf is bigger and they have very prolific water. Now, a lot of the fishing done in other countries' EZ is done by the industrial fleets, mainly for tuna, sardines, and so on and so forth. But there's also quite a lot of effort done by the artisanal fishing, locally fishing with the neighboring countries. I was talking about the European Union before. The European Union, everything happening in the European Union is considered to be in the domestic EZ. If France fishes in German waters, vice versa, it's considered domestic because of the reciprocal agreements that they have. It would be way too complicated to figure out where is what. Now, oops, what's happening here? Now combining the location and the status, we get this graph. So the color respected, so the green is the domestic fishing happening in domestic EZ, blue is fishing happening in foreign EZ, and the red orangish is the fishing happening in the high seas. As you can see, the lion's share of the effort is carried by developing or developed nations in their own EZ. So interesting to see that there isn't much difference between developing or developed countries with regard to the proportion of the fishing done in their own EZ. So you take a developing country or developed countries, and in that case, developing, I'm including the least developed countries. So if you take a developing country or developed country, both fish about 3/4 of the effort in their own EZ and the rest either in a foreign EZ or the high seas. My computer is having a conniption, sorry about that. Now I'm going to talk about the sectorial disaggregation. The industrial fleet's effort is slightly bigger than the artisanal, but not by much. And that is also heavily dependent on definition. As you're probably all aware, there is no clear definition of what an artisanal vessel is, at least not globally. There's even a lot of discussion on whether or not to use the word artisanal or small scale, or there's a lot of plethora of words that can be used, which are also heavily dependent on the language use. Latin countries speaking French, Spanish, and so on and so forth have the tendency to use more the word artisanal, while English-speaking countries have the tendency to use word more small scale. These definitions also do not necessarily translate well. Other languages, especially Asian languages, do not have concepts like that. So what has been done here in this calculation to make sure that to put everybody, well, to give everybody the word artisanal industrial, but without having clear black and white cut, is to use actually the definition of the country. So in this data, what is considered artisanal fishing is going to be what the country legally or in practice defines as being artisanal or small scale or whatever word they're using. So for instance, in the European Union, they consider to be small scale any vessel which is less than 12 meters and not using towed gear, so not using trawls, basically. So for any country of the European Union, I'm using that definition. For other countries which are going to use a type of vessels or type of gear or type of fleets or distance to the shore and so on and so forth, I'm going to use that definition. So I am respecting the country wishes of defining themselves what artisanal small scale means. There is a caveat in that. I am a scientist and I'm interested in numbers. And when it comes to numbers, well, defining a fleet, for instance, with the distance from the coast, which is very common, especially in Southeast Asia, artisanal fleet are going to be defined as being the fleet that fishing within 3 kilometers or nautical mile from the coast, and then there's the medium scale and the large scale. These are not very easy to reflect. So there's going to be a bit of calculation done to actually convert that effort into artisanal or industrial, while keeping that distance from the coast, but to try to make it a bit more manageable. If anyone is interested in which definition we use, there is a 100-page document that people can refer to that explain all of this in details. But the gist of it is that if a country says that their artisanal is the longline fishery, that's what I'm using. I'm using the longline fishery to be artisanal in this country. I don't think any country does that, but that's just an example. So that's for the effort. When Ms. Palomares will talk about the catch, there will be slightly different ones. In general, the two concepts kind of match one another because it will work, but there is different definitions. Quite often, the more popular, I mean popular as in like the people aspect of it, the livelihood can be taken into account. Since I'm talking about the boat themselves, the livelihood of the people is, well, not something that unfortunately I can talk about. Combining the sectorial aspects with the development status, we can see that the industrial fishing fleet of developing countries, not developed, so including these developed countries, is actually close to half of the global fishing effort, more than the actual artisanal effort. Again, a lot of leeway in this definition of artisan fleets, since a lot of these countries are actually using a distance. It is possible that there is a bit of miscategorization. That's why usually when you look at a lot of the different studies that have been done in the last 20 years on artisanal versus industrial fleets, the value fluctuates around 50%, but it can be anything between 40 and 60. At the end of the day, if the cutoff point is, I don't know, 10 tons to be an artisanal fishing fleet. If last year the average was 9.9, it was artisanal, but if this year is 10.1, it would be considered industrial. But realistically, there is very little difference between the two. It is a definition term. It does not necessarily mean that there's going to be a much bigger impact because the fishing fleet is officially industrial rather than artisanal. It's more what the fleet actually is the problem. Anyway, so it's just to show that again, this slightly dated concept that industrial developed countries' effort is the majority of the world is actually not true anymore. It used to be. It used to be in the 60s, 70s, and part of the 80s. The developed countries, the industrial fleet was the lion's share of the effort. Nowadays, it's not the case. Developing countries, industrial and artisanal, are actually making the bulk of the effort. And that concludes for me my summary of the effort data. I'm sorry that I gave you quite a lot of raw data and numbers and percentage and all these kind of things, but I hope that they give you an insight on what's going on and where the effort is and, well, what's happening. Same again, the raw data is available on the IMAS data portal. The data is quite raw, so if you have any question, any problem, or if you want to know a bit more about how to handle, there's always possibility to discuss that. And back to you, Alice.
Super, Yannick, thank you very much indeed. It's fascinating, and I think it's a really important kind of update to our understanding of where fishing effort actually happens. And we're going to get to the question of catch in just a moment, and then we'll cover subsidies at the end.